I hope everyone had a great lunch and fruitful discussion, especially after Ibram Kendi's talk on state violence and the anti-racist struggle. My name is Spencer Ciarelli, for those who do not know me. I am a doctoral candidate in the sociology department here on Case campus, as well as one of the members of the social justice leadership team and on the think tank planning committee. So I'm thrilled to finally see a year of planning come into fruition. I'm also happy to say I will be facilitating the session, which centers around the intersection of state violence with internment and immigration, environmental justice, and indigenous rights. We will begin with time for each presenter to talk, but have made it a point to block the last 25 minutes of the session for the audience to ask questions, and therefore ensure there is an active dialogue. So while everyone settles in, I'll begin by making some introductions of our distinguished speakers. First, we have Dr. John Flores, who is a member of the Social Justice Institute's leadership team and a professor of history here at Case Western Reserve University. He writes about Mexican immigration with interests including the history of immigration and citizenship in the United States, as well as multinational political and labor movements. Next, I'm also happy to introduce Ms. Kim Foreman, who is the Executive Director of Environmental Health Watch and focuses on issues and adverse outcomes of environmental exposure that disproportionately impact poor and minority communities. Ms. Kim Foreman is also a licensed lead risk assessor and Roots of Success instructor. We also have Mr. Frank Abe, who produced, wrote, and directed Conscience and the Constitution, an award-winning documentary about the largest organized resistance to the World War II incarceration of Japanese Americans. Mr. Frank Abe has 2 books coming out in 2017, John Okada, The Life and Rediscovered Works of the Author of No Boy, as well as a graphic novel dramatizing the resistance inside America's wartime concentration camps for Wing Luke Asian Museum. And last but not least, we have Mr. Guy Jones, who is Hunkpapa Lakota and full-blooded member of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. He's the co-founder and executive director of the Miami Valley Council for Native Americans, as well as the co-author of the book, Lessons from Turtle Island. So without further ado, I would like to hand over the mic to Dr. John Flores to kick us off.
All right, thank you all for coming. And I thought I would begin by just starting off with a concept that's tied to many of the themes that we've already been discussing at the conference. So in the European Union, immigrant rights activists chant, "We are here because you are there." And what they mean by that is we Asian, African, and Latin American immigrants are in Europe because you Europeans have a long history of migrating into our homelands in search of land, laborers, raw materials, markets, and, most importantly today, sites for your military bases. In the United States, we don't widely recognize our history of imperialism. And as a consequence, we've produced a very distorted understanding of immigration. Because if we really want to understand why the Mexicans and Central Americans come here, we actually need to begin by acknowledging and understanding what we've done there in their homelands. In the wake of the Mexican-American War, we take over more than 500,000 acres of Mexican land. And by the 1880s, American entrepreneurs start migrating well beyond the borders of the expanding United States, and thousands begin entering Mexico and Central America. These Americans weren't entering Mexico and renting apartments or buying single-family homes the way many immigrants do in the United States. These Americans were using their contacts in the United States government and their relationship that they were developing with the dictatorship in Mexico, the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz, in order to acquire hundreds of thousands of acres of land, in order to acquire plantations, lucrative mines, ranches, and oil fields. Throughout the late 1800s, Americans were migrating into Mexico by the thousands. By 1910, there's over 75,000 Americans operating various types of businesses in Mexico. Elites that we can think of, people like J.P. Morgan, investors like him, corporate heads like Robert Colgate of the Colgate-Palmolive Company, were all entering Mexico in this time and will all begin to set up transportation and communication networks in order to get at Mexican natural resources, in order to sell those Mexicans U.S. manufactured goods. So this process is going on throughout the 1800s, and a similar process is going on throughout the rest of Central America. Only 2 years after that Mexican-American War, we occupy Nicaragua. In 1855, we reoccupy Nicaragua. In 1857, we then reoccupy Nicaragua. And in 1899, a group of businessmen in Boston, Massachusetts, get together, and they form what they call the United Fruit Company. Within 5 years, they control over 200,000 acres of land in Central America, and by the 1940s, they control over 1 million acres of land throughout Central America. In the early 1900s, the people of Nicaragua elect a liberal president named Jose Zelaya to the presidency. And Zelaya immediately begins to argue that US and foreign corporations, including United Fruit, should be paying taxes in Nicaragua. That's right, at this point in time, most of these corporations pay 0 taxes in the countries in which they're extracting very lucrative natural resources. So when Zelaya begins asking this, the United States immediately withdraws its recognition of the Zelaya administration, and we begin basically recruiting and even at times arming his opposition. The Nicaraguan people rebel as a consequence of what they see the United States doing, which they define as activities of US imperialism in their territory. And when they do that, we send in the Marines. And between 1910 and 1933, we occupy Nicaragua. It's during that occupation that Nicaraguan people start immigrating into the United States. Nicaraguans start making their way to New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. And there they meet Puerto Ricans, and there they meet Mexicans, who collectively all begin to acknowledge and discuss what many immigrants from Latin America understood then, that many Americans still don't understand now, which is the United States is an empire, and US imperial practices in Latin America have engendered immigration. Things begin to change in the context of World War I. World War I recalibrates the relationship between the United States and Latin America. World War I cut off the historic supply of European immigrant labor that US corporations had become accustomed to. Between 1880 and World War I, anywhere between 700,000 to 1 million Europeans were coming into the United States per year. They didn't need passports. They didn't need them. We don't institutionalize passports until 1918. They didn't need visa documents. We don't institutionalize visas until 1921. That is, Europeans were coming and going, and they were coming freely because our courts largely defined them as, quote, free white persons, end quote, who were entitled and had the right to come and go. So between the 1880s and World War I, they're coming by the hundreds of thousands, and World War I puts a stop to that migration stream, and US corporations that were used to using immigrant laborers that were non-citizens and that were not fully protected by our Constitution, laborers that did not have roots here and therefore would not have much community support, and laborers that were very mobile and could be sent anywhere that they were needed and let go and released and fired when they weren't. US corporations begin turning to Mexicans, and we start what's called the temporary admissions program, and we start recruiting thousands of Mexicans into the United States. In the context of our Great Depression, we now start scapegoating Mexican immigrants, and we start expelling thousands and thousands of Mexicans from the United States. We ultimately end up deporting or expelling more than 500,000, anywhere between 400,000 and 500,000. But just as those Depression-era deportations were coming to an end, Europe is once again at war, and US corporations once again begin demanding the use of non-citizen laborers, and we now start the Bracero program between 1942 and 64. And we recruit anywhere between 4 to maybe 5 million Mexicans to come into the United States to serve as laborers. So as you can see, a pattern is developing here, where we recruit Mexicans where our economy is expanding and we need them, and we start driving them out and we'll deport them when our economy is contracting. And that's exactly what begins to happen. As soon as the war ends and we enter into our Cold War, we start mass deporting Mexicans. But as you can see by that year, that's going on between 51 and 54, while the Bracero program is still going on. That is, while certain INS agents, the Department of Labor and the Unemployment Service, is actually tasked with recruiting thousands of Mexicans into the United States, other agents of the INS, the police departments across in various cities in the US, and the FBI are coordinating mass deportations. So who are they deporting? What you find is they are targeting immigrants who are demanding better working conditions, better jobs, the people who are challenging the exploitation that is going on. And the capstone project of our government in the context of the Cold War deportation campaign is Operation Wetback, which is what they named it in 1954. That's what they named that. And 1954 is a very important year for Latinos because in that year, we also overthrow the democratically elected government of Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala. So the year that we deport more Mexicans from this country than we had ever deported before is the year we concurrently overthrow a democratically elected president in Guatemala that is demanding higher wages, better working conditions, and better opportunities for the people of his nation state. And that's really what's happening here. That is, we're sending Latinos a very clear message. You're here to be laborers, menial laborers in your country of origin, and you're here to do that here in this country. That's what you're here to do. And things start getting very, very brutal, and things start turning even worse, if you can believe that, in the post-60s, 70s, and into the Clinton years. The Bracero program ends in 1964. 1 year later, in 1965, Mexico and the U.S. start what they call the Border Industrialization Program, and that program begins to assist U.S. corporations to move their operations right across the border into Mexico, a process that had been going on, as I'm saying, since the 1800s, but now our government is directly assisting in that process with the BIP. And that process only accelerates under Bill Clinton and NAFTA in 1994. And that's where there are further, darker, more horrible, more grotesque, more inhuman developments that start occurring. But I think in order to contextualize that, I'd like to show us a 1-minute clip of President Bill Clinton, our Democratic president, talking about immigrants and immigration. And if you end up closing your eyes to this clip, you could tell me if you hear a Republican or a Democrat.
All Americans, not only in the states most heavily affected, but in every place in this country, are rightly disturbed by the large numbers of illegal aliens entering our country. The jobs they hold might otherwise be held by citizens or legal immigrants. The public service they use impose burdens on our taxpayers. That's why our administration has moved aggressively to secure our borders more, by hiring a record number of new border guards, by deporting twice as many criminal aliens as ever before, by cracking down on illegal hiring, by barring welfare benefits to illegal aliens. In the budget I will present to you, we will try to do more to speed the deportation of illegal aliens who are arrested for crimes, to better identify illegal aliens in the workplace, as recommended by the commission headed by former Congresswoman Barbara Jordan. We are a nation of immigrants, but we are also a nation of laws. It is wrong and ultimately self-defeating for a nation of immigrants to permit the kind of abuse of our immigration laws we have seen in recent years, and we must do more to stop it.
So as you see, it's under Bill Clinton that we get both NAFTA and in 94, and we also get what he calls Operation Gatekeeper, which he's alluding to in that State of the Union speech. Operation Gatekeeper is going to make it more difficult for Mexicans to escape the exploitation of U.S. corporations who are being assisted by our government to enter Mexico via NAFTA. So you're going to be exploited there, and it's going to be even harder for you to come here. Within 2 years, Clinton gives us more legislation that makes life even more brutal for immigrants. He gives his 1996 Illegal Immigration Act and his Anti-Terrorism and so-called, I hate even saying this, Effective Death Penalty Act. You're making death penalty more effective. That's what Bill Clinton gives us. And in the context of his acts, which begin to further criminalize Mexican people and begin to make their lives even more difficult, we start seeing the growth of the for-profit prison industry in the United States as it's incarcerating non-citizens. Now, it's true there are scholars who say this kind of begins in the 70s, kind of begins in the 80s, but Clinton's legislation criminalized all sorts of behaviors for immigrants and increased the number of immigrants that were being sent to detention centers. It's under Clinton that these types of policies are passed. To give you some sense of what I'm talking about, because ultimately it doesn't just stop or it doesn't even get, that much worse under the following presidencies. In a way, it's a continuation of what Bill Clinton begins to do. That is, what Bill Clinton begins, George Bush then accelerates under programs like Operation Streamline and under programs like E-Verify, and then Barack Obama perpetuates. So it just continues. So from the 1990s forward, in the 1980s, maybe there were something like 4,800 immigrants being held across the United States in detention centers. After Clinton's legislation, that number jumps to about 8,500 immigrants being held per day in detention centers. Under Barack Obama, that number jumps to 34,000 immigrants being held per day in detention centers. And across the country now, yearly, some 400,000 non-citizens are held in various types of detention centers. So what's taking place here is even worse, actually. It's an even worse and more alarming and more disgusting development. It is really horrible to deport somebody. It's even worse to do actually what Barack Obama did, which is prosecute people and then expel them. He did that to more than 3 million people. Barack Obama deported, that is, he prosecuted and expelled from our country more Mexicans and Central Americans than any president in U.S. history. And after Barack Obama did that, we already had the mechanization and process here, the machine in place to start funneling all those people who are trying to escape exploitation in Latin America into for-profit prisons in the U.S. And there they languish for years. And I'll leave us with just this tiny segment of a quote because my time is up. But what the ACLU finds time and again is that these for-profit prisons don't have to adhere to any of the regulations, the limited regulations that we have that govern public prisons. That is, they can just violate everything. They'll have one doctor per 2,000 inmates. The ACLU found a common practice is taking people who are part of their overflow and just putting them in isolation units, even though they are completely compliant. That is, people are complying, and they actually say, I have done nothing wrong, but yet they're placed in isolation units that these private prisons actually define as corrective, as a unit that's supposed to be for punishment, and that's what they're doing because there's no regulations almost that they have to adhere to because they are for-profit prisons. Since my time is up, in the Q&A, I'd be glad to talk about what I think we can do and where I think we need to go if we want to address this injustice. Thank you.
Hello. I really want to thank Social Justice Institute for asking me to come participate today. I'm very honored. I'm going to try to lay out a little bit of the technical aspects of lead poisoning because I've been asked to talk about that, and it is a medical situation and an environmental toxin, so I really don't want to assume that people really understand the effects of lead coming into this conversation, so I'm going to talk about that a little bit. But I do want to say my organization's been around for 35 years. I've been there 20 years, and so the core of our program is around healthy homes, and we're leaders in the healthy homes movement. We're pioneers in that, as well as sustainable communities. So we have a technical expertise that's necessary to really talk about practical solutions to this particular issue around housing, asthma, lead. And so this is just a demonstration of all the direct service projects we've done, research projects, that informs our advocacy because we listen to the people. We in their homes, we're educating them in the home. We go out into community, particular communities of color, to talk through issues and solutions. So we bring that perspective with us as an environmental organization, which is unique. And so that when we're at the table with decision makers, we can bring that perspective. And we are planning the next Race, Food, and Justice Conference. So I'm glad to be a partner with Social Justice Institute and Ridall to work on things like race, food, and justice. So in the Sustainable Communities program, those are the types of things I do dealing with food access and justice, but our core is the healthy homes. So with that, I want to further my notes so I won't miss out anything. Our approach is very holistic from the beginning, and the intersection and connectedness of everything is how we approach our work. We are a small nonprofit, so we collaborate with everyone. Anybody who touches children, we can find a connection in regards to this issue. And I can't go into a deep dive right now because I only have 12 minutes, but I do a lot of outreach to a lot of organizations and people, and we've impacted policy on a national level with this approach, and so we bring our expertise with us. Now, across the country, public health is starting to talk through this issue of social determinants of health and health equity, which we call out racism, and policies that are part of the systemic racism that we see that impacts our communities. Now, it's one thing to write it up in a grant. It's another thing to host conversations or trainings and all that. But the other issue I find is when we are at the table, the implementation of equity is a whole nother process. And so you might see the glossy text with equity and social justice aspects, but when we get in the room and really try to hash out the root causes of a thing, it gets to be interesting. And so we're focused on the housing and the substandard housing that impacts our communities. And so we move away from the programmatic approaches and really start to dig into the systematic issues that are impacting the health of residents. And so if you look at social determinants of health and frame it that way, then we start to look beyond programs and really start to dig into those issues that impact the health. So I want you to take a look at this map and think about it, because I want you to remember this map when I show you some others. So this is a map from 2004, and so I'm going to describe to you what 5 micrograms per deciliter means, because that determines the action level in which we decide a child is poisoned. So if you had a penny, that's 2 grams. You cut that in half. So you have 1 gram. You take that half a penny and cut it up into 1,000 pieces. Take that one little piece of those 1,000 and chop that up again. So if a child has 5 of those pieces in 1/10 of a liter of blood, that child is considered poisoned. If you have 40 of those in a square foot on the floor, that floor is considered contaminated. So you got to understand the amounts that we're talking about that impact the brain, the body, the chemistry. So we as a county, we actually push for that 5 to be designated nationally. So the work we've done across the county, we started with 10 micrograms per deciliter as an action level, and we moved nationally to push it down to 5, and that was done in our county, which talks and points to the leadership we've been able to provide to the nation. So the children in 2004 are 13 years old now. So just to list out, these are not all the effects of lead. This is not to say that if a child is lead poisoned, they're going to display all of these effects. It's a silent epidemic because there's no signs or symptoms of lead poison. It's not like I could look at a child and tell they're lead poison. There's no safe level of lead in the blood. We know at level 5, your IQ decreases. So when we talk about the school system, we talk about community health and public health. This is a crisis, right? So think about all those children that were impacted in that map. All of the city of Cleveland is a high risk, is a high risk zone. So we have had plenty of studies. We knew since the 1900s that lead was bad, right? We've studied it. We've done all the research we need to know the effects of lead poison, the long-term effects. Lead sits in the bone. So once a child is lead poisoned, that lead does not exit the body, it deposits in the bone. If I become pregnant and I had lead poison, I could leach that lead into my fetus. So when we talk about the school to prison pipeline, I like to think more the poison in the prison pipeline, because children are poisoned at 1, at 2, at 3, and at 4 years old. And so when we talk about the funding, and I'll talk about that next, about how are we finding these children? So why are we still allowing these children to be exposed? if we understand the long-term effects. We've been working on this for decades. So I'm part of what used to be called the Place Matters team, which is now the Centers for Achieving Equity. In 2015, we worked with the Kerwin Institute to look at redlining and its effect in housing policy and city planning policies that have impacted health. So redlining is the practice of denying or charging more for services such as banking, insurance, access to housing, healthcare, supermarkets, or denying jobs to residents, and particularly often racially determined areas. These areas most frequently discriminate against were Black inner city neighborhoods. And I say we're still suffering, of course, we talked about that all day, some of these impacts, but the city and the county governments had these policies. I'm gonna read some of this information, and I did submit the report to Lisa. I also submitted some other information materials for you to look at. So on the left side, none of the said lands, interest therein, or improvements thereon shall be sold, resold, conveyed, leased, rented, or in any way used, occupied, or acquired by any person of Negro blood or to any person of Semitic race, blood, or origin, which with racial description shall be deemed to include Armenians, Jews, Hebrews, Persians, or Syrians. The other piece says, I'm gonna read a little bit. No property in said addition shall at any time be sold, conveyed, rented, or leased in whole or in part to any person or persons not of white or Caucasian race. So this was our planning policy. So you see where the red is, and I guess, can you figure out what red means? So this is from our Cleveland Metropolitan District in Cuyahoga County. This is where the majority of African Americans lived in 1940. So this is the latest map in 2015 that shows the progress we've made working in a collaborative fashion, but we're not done, right? So we've done a lot of work, and the work is not a result of just having HUD programs. So I want to talk a little bit about that too. But I think we've had that funding to bring people together, to kind of push for the changes, and to really look at our housing stock and work with clients and work with residents. So we've had a really robust time of partnering, putting it together, marketing, educating, and I know that that has a lot to do with the changes we see, but we're not done. Glenville, Clark Fulton, and East Cleveland have still 1 in every 5 children are being poisoned. This is Glenville. So you can see at the census tract level, we have a lot of data around lead. So we can make a lot of changes, and we can learn a lot because we have all the data we need to make different decisions. So the Centers of Disease Control calculated that $43 billion in annual costs for medical care and potential productivity losses of affected children. We're dealing with that. In 2012, the funding for Centers of Disease Control lead poison prevention programs, which is like screening for lead, dropped from $29 million to $2 million. So think about that. For 2013, they're funding now, but just imagine all of the lost children that we could have been capturing with robust screening programs. So the city of Cleveland, some of you might know, not know, lost its funding to remediate homes in 2012, but also what happened with that situation is the whole health department basically shut down. So everyone's employment was based on this HUD funding. So I feel that the city, the state, never really brought general funds to this crisis. And so we had to lay off basically the entire health department. We have one case manager to manage all of the cases in the city of Cleveland. And half of the cases in the state of Ohio come from Cuyahoga County. So that's another issue around policy and pushing for change, that if people don't see it as a problem for the state, it's very hard to convince people to look at funding to support this, because it's a City of Cleveland problem, it's a Cuyahoga County problem. So also, I always ask the question about testing, because what happens in a doctor's office is that children are not automatically tested in the doctor's office. Parents are sent to off-site locations or sent to a lab where they have to wait for hours, and a lot of children don't get confirmed testing done or even tested. WIC does not test children. WIC is drawing blood from children, but they will not run a test. Any child on Medicaid will get that test paid for. So this is some of the questioning around policies and actions. Ohio Department of Health will not accept a capillary test that could potentially be taken in a doctor's office. So these are some of the questions around getting at screening rates and helping families deal with the situation. We don't even know where all the children are who are lead poisoned. So in my role, we all have roles, right? So in my role, I kind of sit at the table working on reform and policy, and I do work with decision makers. So everyone has their role in this solution around lead poisoning. Has anyone, I'm in love with Rachel and Bree, who came out with the Toxic Neglect Lead series. Has anyone seen it, heard of it? Of the Toxic Neglect Lead series in the Plain Dealer? Okay. They'll be here talking to you later. So Bree and Rachel spent about 1.5 years. Articles came out just about every day, and they peeled back so many layers around the history of the problem, who's done what, the policies. I mean, they really are digging deep to really call out some of these issues. What happened is they got so much traction that the New York Times came to Cleveland. So we have a New York Times really talking about that Flint, unfortunately Flint happened, but they also compared the issues around the housing in Cleveland and the issues around lead, and that we have way more children poisoned in Cleveland living in substandard housing. They talked about Glenville. They highlighted families in Glenville. Al Jazeera came calling around the RNC time, so I submitted the film to Lisa, 20 minutes to talk about the lead poison epidemic in Cleveland. They tried to interview the mayor. He was interested in RNC, so they really went around the community. They talked with us. They talked to Rachel. So that's a 20-minute documentary. That Al Jazeera was extremely interested in the social justice aspect of this epidemic, and I appreciate them for that. So if you get a chance, you might want to take a look at that, and hopefully Bree and Rachel talk about that a little bit. So legal aid got in the fight, and they sued the city. So you can look that up. They're suing the city for failing to address the EBLs. So all of that is kind of laid out in these articles, and it's just been an extremely hot topic across the country and in the city due to the fact of Bree and Rachel uncovering a lot. Jeff Johnson. We have a lead maintenance certificate on the books, never was enforced, it was voluntary. So he submitted legislation to make it mandatory, which I am in support of. We'll see how far that goes. So I also always like to talk about solutions. So I'm working on some national projects called the Bill Health Challenge, and we are working on our 3rd year. We've gotten 2 years down. We're working on a 3rd year for a 2nd round. And when we started with Bill Health, we had a lot of partners around the table. The city, building and housing, public health was one of them. When I first started, I was told that we would never have a proactive inspection policy. People didn't even understand what Healthy Homes was. So through the Bill Health Challenge work, we've been able to push for code enforcement of the rental registry. When we started, we have over 90,000 rental units in the city of Cleveland. We only had 30 registered. After the 2 years, we're at about 42, and now we're at about 52. But the policies were never being enforced. So we never knew where the rental properties was, so how could we address this issue? So that's being enforced. The city started a proactive inspection program, and we integrated some data. Right in Glenville, we had a Greater University Circle Community Health Initiative that we're working on, and anybody can join those efforts. So back to our culture, the way we work in a collaborative fashion. I'm at the table, I'm pushing for change in this capacity in my lane. And so this is where we're at now, but we really want to get residents to have access to an app that will be developed by programmers. But our first step is really talk with residents around their needs, around housing, and how they select housing. So I do have some cards, and I really want to gather information from landlords and renters around housing issues so that we can come together and work on some more policy changes. And so this is just a list of some accomplishments and what we're looking for in by 2019 to accomplish. And so liberation is our goal. So although we have a lot of barriers, we still have to try to get rid of them and free ourselves from all of this crap. So thank you. Appreciate you.
Well, thank you, Tim Black and Lisa Collins for staging this social justice think tank today. Thanks, Tim. Okay, so I'm Frank Abe. I'm going to talk to you about the state violence involved in the mass exclusion, eviction, and incarceration that occurred in World War II based solely on race. And as I tell a story, I want you to think about this history not as history, but as something that you want to look out for today in regards to criminalization of religion or mass exclusion of people based on their immigration status. So there it goes. This is a picture of a stockade at Tule Lake Segregation Center on the California-Oregon border, 1944. Why are these men here? They're being rough-housed by guards at Tule Lake. There's another photo of these guys with clubs raised in the air, beating them up. These were some of the 120,313 Japanese Americans evicted from the West Coast after Pearl Harbor. December 7, 41, Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, 3,000 Americans killed at Pearl Harbor. President Roosevelt signs an executive order 75 years ago to exclude all persons of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast, regardless of their, without trial, without hearing, without any form of screening. How many citizens were in camp? American citizens? 2/3 of them were American citizens. Some other numbers, and of course the reason for the eviction was fear of sabotage and espionage. Because we looked like the enemy, we couldn't be trusted. We couldn't be allowed to stay in our homes. So, some numbers, how many children were born in camp? Well, there were 10 concentration camps spread throughout the inlands of the western United States. 6,000 children born in camp. How many cases were there of espionage and sabotage occurring? 0. Number of people who died in camp, 1,900, mostly natural causes. Number of people shot and killed in camp by sentries, 7. This is a drawing of a 65-year-old man walking near the fence at Topaz, Utah. We think that he was either going for a ball that rolled near the fence or was going for a walk and was hard of hearing. Couldn't hear the guard in the guard tower with a rifle shouting at him to stop. So he was shot in the back and killed. The private was tried for manslaughter, was acquitted, and fined for unauthorized use of government property. The amount of his fine was $1, the cost of the bullet used to kill the man. Two more numbers. Economic violence of the incarceration in terms of property losses, $3 to $6 billion today. Civil rights violations, several amendments in the Bill of Rights. So I wanted to speak here today at Case Western because I was born here at Case Western 66 years ago at McDonald Maternity Hospital, just a few steps away. And so the question this picture poses for me of maternity hospital is, why was I born here in Cleveland? Why did I grow up a few blocks away in the Huff District on East 81st Street near Chester? I'm not complaining. I had a great childhood here. My father worked in a machine shop making air conditioners. We owned a 3-story boarding house on East 81st. My mother would clean the rooms upstairs. My whole world consisted of the other Japanese kids at the Cleveland Buddhist Church on East 81st Street. In the center, surrounded by the African American community of the 1950s. And of course, the reason was the eviction and incarceration. My father grew up in San Jose, California, onion picker. He was happy there, bachelor, but he gets taken from the West Coast simply because he looks like the Japanese enemy. And there's a fear of espionage, invasion, and sabotage. Gets put in the concentration camp at Hart Mountain, Wyoming, in the bachelor's quarters. He always wanted to be a cook, so here he gets to start peeling potatoes at the mess hall. And so that's the answer, short answer, of why I was born here in Cleveland. After the war, after the camps closed, the government resettled us, a lot of us, in the East and Midwest. This is his citizen's his indefinite leave card from Hart Mountain, allowing him to go to Cleveland, Ohio, December 13th, 1944, where we got established here. Like most of my generation, I didn't learn any of this until I was in high school and college, like you guys. And when we asked our parents, what happened, well, A, they didn't talk about it. The families didn't talk to their kids about this because of a mixture of 3 things. Guilt, the sense that because I spent 3 years in a concentration camp in Wyoming, I must have done something wrong. So I want to, certainly forget about that. Suppressed rage. A lot of these Nisei, they didn't talk about it because they were still angry for 40 years about what happened. They were, and my generation was, disinherited of $3 to $6 billion in economic losses that we would have had today had we not been kicked out of our homes on the West Coast. And the third reason was protecting the children, that because they were angry and because they were, felt this guilt, they didn't want to pass that on to the children. And if they talked about it, the fear in general, the unspoken fear was, don't talk about it and protect the kids, let them go up and be happy and go to college, which we did. But so, we'd ask our parents, why didn't you, if they'd done that to me, I would have fought back. I would have resisted. And then the answer, they would pat us on the head and say, oh, well, you weren't born then. Times were different then. You can't apply your Berkeley civil rights activism of the 60s to 1942. And the code was, don't judge us. You can't judge us for what we did. So when I discovered, through some friends, the existence of an organized resistance at my father's camp at Hart Mountain, and today I want to talk to you about 2 examples of how Japanese Americans organized against this state violence. The resistance at Hart Mountain, it was like the missing link to me, because Japanese Americans, the party line was, our response to this massive injustice was one of 2 Japanese words. Shikatta ga nai, Japanese for it can't be helped, passive resignation in the face of state violence, or go for broke, Hawaiian pidgin for go all out, give 100%, patriotic self-sacrifice to prove one's loyalty to America. And that, of course, never sat right with me. I couldn't see myself in that narrative. So when we discovered that there was an organized resistance at Hart Mountain, it was to me like a missing link. Frank Emmy was one of the leaders of the Fair Play Committee at Hart Mountain. At the time this picture was taken, 1944, they'd been in camp for 2 years. The war with Japan was almost a fait accompli. The Battle of Midway in 42 reversed the tide of war. There was no threat of Japan invading the West Coast after middle of 42. But the government had this bureaucracy in place, the War Relocation Authority, WRA, a civilian administration in the Department of Interior, which of course comes up later because one of the camps was a former Indian reservation in Gila River, Arizona. And a lot of these administrators, these Caucasian administrators in the camps were, wait for it, former administrators of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So it was not a great leap to go from Indian boarding school relocation to relocation, euphemism, relocation of Japanese Americans in World War II. So they've been there 2 years. Coldest winter in Wyoming, 30 degrees below zero. You hear stories about hardship, physical hardship. I'm not going to, it was hard. And so they've been there 2 years. And in January '44, the government decides, through some urging of my friends in the Japanese American Citizens League who collaborated with the government in the original eviction and waived our civil rights to protest the internment, but that's another story, decided to reinstitute selective service in the camps, to draft young men out of camp to go fight in the US Army. A lot of guys wanted to fight. They volunteered. Because if you could fight and join the Army, that proves you were an equal American. And their fear at the time was they had lost their citizenship. Well, if you can volunteer, then it proves you're a citizen. But these guys says, well, if you draft us, great, we're happy to fight. But first, restore our rights and free our families from camp, let them go home. I'm not going to leave my family in this concentration camp and go fight in France and Italy. So they also saw this as a last chance, 1944, 2 years into the camps, a last hook to bring a test case into court, break a law to prove your case. And the law they broke was the Selective Service Act of 1940. They got the draft notices in camp. They refused or they failed to report for their draft physicals. That was the inciting incident. They organized, and this was their manifesto. Is filled with references to the Fifth Amendment, no one deprived of liberty or property without due process, the 13th Amendment, prohibition against involuntary servitude, and the language. I'll just read quickly. We members of the Fair Play Committee unanimously decided at the last open meeting that until we are restored all our rights, all discriminatory features of selective service abolished, and the measures are taken to remedy the past injustices through judicial pronouncement or congressional act, we feel that the present program of drafting us from this concentration camp, their words, not mine, is unjust, unconstitutional, and against all principles of civilized usage. Therefore, we members of the Fair Play Committee hereby refuse to go to the physical examination or to the induction if or when we are called in order to contest the issue. They got arrested. They went to court. It was the largest mass trial in the history of U.S. history, the largest mass trial for draft resistance in U.S. history. This is the federal courthouse in Cheyenne, Wyoming. But it was a bench trial, and the judge decided that the only issue before the court was whether or not you failed to appear for physical. Did you appear or not? Did you break the law or not? Well, yes, we did. Well, I'm not going to hear anything about Constitution. That's not before the court. So, guilty, 3 years in prison in a federal prison. This was the subject of my film, Conscience and the Constitution, which aired on PBS in 2000. We have 10 copies for sale outside at a discount, so you can take a look at the film. So they went to prison, and basically, the Japanese America branded them as draft dodgers, no-no boys, and ostracized them. So when they came back to Seattle, and in my hometown, Seattle, they were spat upon by the veterans and marginalized. And the book I'm doing next year, John Okada's No-No Boy, I highly recommend you read that novel about the inner torment of a draft resistor who questions his actions in this history. So the resistors lost. The famous cases that went to the Supreme Court also lost, Hirabayashi, Korematsu, Yasui. And for 35 years, Japanese America stayed quiet. The precedent remained on the books. And the Nisei stewed and raised their kids and went on with their lives. 35 years later, the kids grow up, people like me and my colleagues. The unresolved issue of the incarceration, as one Justice Murphy, Supreme Court said, it, these decisions lay waiting like a loaded weapon for the government to use again, spurred a group in Seattle, and this is written not by a Sansei, a third-generation person like myself, but by an Issei man. On the left here, the Shosuke Sasaki, is 80-year-old securities analyst in Seattle. And these are all Nisei guys who were teenagers in camp. Organizing, like the Fair Play Committee in Hard Mountain organized. In Seattle, the Seattle chapter JACL, the Maverick chapter so-called, organized to petition the government for redress of grievances under the Constitution. They brought a bill before Congress from Congressman Mike Lowry, and our friend S.I. Hayakawa, at the time California senator, denounced it as not justified. Of course, he was Japanese Canadian, wasn't in camp. Wall Street Journal accused us of guilt-mongering, that we're looking for some kind of payout from the government, that we're cheapening the experience. So we organized, in my mind, a media event to kind of turn the tide of public opinion. We organized the very first Day of Remembrance in 1978, and these are now an invented tradition in Japanese American communities all along the Midwest and East Coast to remember the camps and stand for redress with your families. We didn't know what would happen. 2,000 people came out in 1978 at a time when talk radio was still, whenever the subject would come up, survivors of Pearl Harbor, Pearl Harbor veterans or their widows would say, how dare these Japanese raise this issue? After all, they bombed Pearl Harbor, and again, making that link between us and the enemy. This is the largest gathering of Japanese Americans in Seattle since World War II. Car caravan, and we reenacted the eviction from Seattle to the Puyallup Fairgrounds, racetrack south of Seattle, hometown concentration camp in 1942. We reenacted the eviction, and inside the cars, parents would finally open up and tell their kids about their experience in being kicked out of their homes in Seattle 35 years previously. One sociologist called it the vault of Japanese American history had burst open on that day with this emotional release for the Nisei. We got national coverage. And this helped spur Congressman Lowry to introduce his bill. Our Japanese American friends in Congress, in order to marginalize us, passed a bill for a study commission instead. And these are our friends, Norm Mineta, Bob Matsui, Mark Matsunaga, Daniel Inoue. They thought we were going too fast. So we were the Maverick chapter, after all. So they formed a study commission, the Commission for Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians, held hearings in 3 West Coast cities. And actually, I admit that it did help, I hate the word, educate the public about the facts of the incarceration. So instead of it being, well, these Japanese people bombed Pearl Harbor, the American public and the media understood that, and the commission concluded that the causes of the eviction were racism, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership, meaning FDR, not by name. And so it was not $3 billion, it was like $1.5 billion in the end, but it did get the attention of Congress, and in 1988, President Reagan did sign the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. So that's our brief story of resistance to both incarceration and resistance to the, or restoration of our history, reclaiming of our history from the state. At this present moment, the indignation, and this is a quote from the last line of John Okada's book, the indignation, the hatred, the patriotism of the American people, end quote, is rising once again to criminalize minorities based on religion, race, or immigration status. Hashtag resistance is now part of the national discourse in social media. I got a lot of calls after the election 1 year ago in November, the national election. about resistance because they saw my website and go, oh, resistance, we can see this is going to be a thing now in this nation. So, Japanese Americans, we have the kind of the moral authority to speak out when we have the moral authority of the lived experience of eviction and incarceration. And that brings the moral responsibility to speak out, I think, when we see this now happening to others. The WRA of 1942 is the DHS, Department of Homeland Security of today. The Western Defense Command of 1942 could be the ICE of today. So with that, I urge you to examine this history and make sure it doesn't happen again. Thanks very much.
Somebody have a clock out there?
2 o'clock.
Tell me when it's 10 minutes. All right. Hi there. My name is Guy Jones. It's a really good Lakota name. All right. Why? Because it's my name. And that's one of the things this is it. I came here to Ohio in 1981. In 1989, we formed the Miami Valley Council for Native Americans. And most people ask us about terminology and about that name. It's the Miami Valley Council for Native Americans. If you are born here, then you're Native. We have a history together. We have a shared history together. And it's important that you not only know your history, but it's important that you know mine as well. Knowing that history and to understand the development and the concepts that have brought us here to today. What has happened? People always ask me questions, and I'm pleased that they ask the question. Because you see, so many of us today, we look for answers, but yet we don't know the right question to ask because we are so ignorant about each other. And that's one of the things that we have to educate ourselves into that. I came to Ohio for one reason, and that was to meet Jewish people. Why did I want to meet Jewish people? Is because I wanted to understand hatred, white people's hatred. You see, I lived in Oklahoma for a while, and it was in Oklahoma that I realized that here were these Christians who not only did they not like black people, they didn't like Mexicans. They didn't like Mexicans. They didn't like me. They didn't like Catholics. And they hated Jews. So I got involved. I began to involve myself with various different communities, and we would go out and we would do things. I got involved with the social movement at that time, not only within my own community, but within other communities, because I began to see a connectiveness. I began to see a relationship. And as I got involved, I began to look. And I said, well, where's the Jewish people at? And they said, if you want to meet some Jews, you got to go east. So that's what I did. I came east. I bought me a ticket to go to New York. But on May 15th, 1981, I got off the bus because of a 2-hour layover in Dayton, Ohio, and I met a Jewish man. And that conversation started. And that conversation is still going on even today. Because you see, I begin to understand a little bit. My understanding, because you see, one of the things is this is it. So many people today, when we look at each other, we only see the physical essence of our being. But we never, ever really spend the time to get to know the mental essence of our being, or even relate to the spiritual essence. Because so many of us today, we get captivated into certain ideologies, and these ologies that plague this nation. The other day, this gentleman got mad at me because he began to explain to me some things. And I reminded him that Islam is part of the Abrahamic faiths. I said, when you look at Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, that is one faith. And when you begin to look at what that faith has done to indigenous people throughout the world, not only here, but throughout the world, then, let's have this conversation. Let's have this conversation. That was one of the things that I began to look at. I come from a very unique family. My grandfather is Pezi. Pezi is the one who led the frontal charge against George Armstrong Custer at Greasy Grass, what is known as the Little Bighorn. That's my grandfather. I am first cousins to Orville Looking Horse, who is the keeper of the White Buffalo Calf Bundle. That is the essence, the origins of our culture and our spirituality. I have a brother who runs ceremony. He's a ceremonial leader. I got a brother who's a Pentecostal minister. I got an uncle who was the first American Indian suffragan bishop of the Episcopal Church, Harold Jones. That's my uncle. I got 3 other uncles who are priests. So I come from a very unique and diverse family. But the one thing is this, is that the foundation was always based on respect. And that's something that I've carried with me and I've always looked at. I've looked at that. And I've maintained that, tried to maintain that. Because you see, in today's times, and it's really hard as this is in Ohio, because you see, not only do you have 576 federally recognized tribes today in the United States, you have over 200 state recognized. But of all of those recognized nations, understand, and especially if you're out there communicating, understand this, that of all those nations, even within those nations, you have traditional people who still maintain language, culture, spirituality, heritage, tradition. They maintain that. And then you have assimilated, who have assimilated into certain ideologies and philosophies and theologies. And then you have descendants. These descendants have been influenced by somebody else who they've had a relationship with. There's a relationship. So you see that. But the largest group out there are wannabes. Now, I'm not talking about white people wanting to be Indian. I'm talking about wannabes. That is one of the things that most sociologists will refer to it as self-hatred. That self-hatred becomes the driving force. And we begin to see that. But you recognize things by the terminology. See, I wrote a book back in 2002. Why did I write that book? It's because I am the father to 8 children. I also have 16 grandchildren today and 2 great-grandchildren. And it was my children. And it was my youngest boy. He came home one day and he said, "Dad, the teacher said I was wrong." So I went to the school and I asked the teacher, "Why would you tell my son he was wrong?" I said, "I understand what you were asking. I understand the question, but is that not?" And I held up a piece of blue paper for her. "Is that not the color of the sky?" She said, "Yes, but that wasn't the answer I wanted." I said, "Is this not the color of the grass?" And she said, "Once again, Mr. Jones, that's not the answer I wanted." And you see, and one of the things today is this, is that we have to begin to realize the aspects, the whole process. We live within a society, a system of laws. And in this system of laws, there is a social construct, the socialization that happens and takes place. It involves acculturation, assimilation, indoctrination, conformity. Even look at the word justice. What is justice? It's about conformity. If you do what is right, do what you're supposed to be doing. I wrote a book. I wrote that book on early childhood education because, you see, my son wasn't wrong. What was wrong was the system was wrong. And we have to begin to recognize that. Yes, there are problems within this nation and within this country today. What are those problems? Those problems begin within. Remember I was talking about the wannabes, the self-hatred? They begin within. In 1992, I was asked to go back to the reservation to come home. The grandmothers in Wakpala said, "Nephew, come home. We need you." Why? Because there were some people coming. And they knew, because you see, I grew up, I went to a public school. I didn't go to the BIA school, I went to a public school. And when I grew up, I would go home and I would sit there with my grandmother and talk to her. She would speak to me in Lakota. And whenever I would try to respond to her, she'd say, "Yeah, English." I didn't realize it till later that I was actually teaching my grandmother English. She'd say, "What's it mean?" And I would tell her. I would tell her what these words were and what they meant. But you see, the community knew that. So when they asked me to come back, because you see, what was happening was there was a number of theologians and linguistic anthropologists that were there who were wanting to translate into the Lakota language the Bible. And I told them this is impossible. Why? Because within the Lakota culture, there are certain concepts that do not exist. And one of those concepts is the concept of sin. It does not exist. The concept of heaven and hell does not exist within our culture. Linguistically, there are certain terminologies that we don't have. We don't have a word for evil. We don't have a word for hate. Now, if you understand indigenous culture, you'll understand that it is based on natural law. And in natural law, there's a duality. So if you don't have a word for hate, guess what else you don't have a word for? Love. We don't have a word for love. But how did you express that? These are emotions. How do you express these emotions? One of love and one of hate. By action. Look in Webster's dictionary. Love is a verb. So, but look at terminology. Terminology is really intriguing and interesting when we begin to look at that. And that's one of the things that all of us examine that. And think about the words. Think about the words with which we use to one another. Thank you.
Thank you. So before I open the discussion to the audience, I want to thank you all for taking the time to talk to us about your topics in relation to state violence. And with that, please feel free to line up behind the microphone over to your left. And while we do, I would like to open it up to the speakers if you have any particular comments or questions for the other speakers before I do open it up to the audience for questions. If you had any questions for one another or comments about one another's topics before I open it to the audience. No? Oh, okay, awesome. All right, and then I believe we can begin taking questions.
Yes, I'd like to unpack the issue of internment right now here in 2017. What do you see the likelihood as that a trajectory based on the racial animus we have now, based on the xenophobia, and based on the hysteria around nativism and white birthright in a settler project? Is that a reality, and are we going to be able to revisit that? And given the conditions on the reservations, are we still looking at the revisiting things that we thought were in our past? And how is that likelihood in terms of invoking the nebulous term of terrorism on a particular incident or group as a opportunity to have en masse incarcerations of Islamic faith, or those who are Latino, or those who may be Asian or gay? What is the likelihood of that by invoking that nebulous term?
The answer is yes, it can happen again. And yes, the likelihood is very high. I would say it's at red alert. It happened before, it can happen again. Let me just go back to 9/11. After the World Trade Center was demolished, there was one attack and immediately calls for the internment of all Iranian Americans and Arab Americans in the nation. Fortunately, the New York Times and other media started talking about the Korematsu decision, talking about the precedent of Japanese American internment in World War II, and there was kind of a moderation. There was a little softening of that fervor. But there was an anthrax scare. There were white powder in letters appearing in Congress, and a lot of you are too young to remember this stuff. But it was an ongoing fear, and I always felt that if there had been a follow-up attack of similar scope after 9/11, that it would have tipped the balance, as it were, into creating the atmosphere for legislation, for action, for let's not be caught napping again. Fortunately, that didn't happen. In short answer, I'll give it to Guy in a minute. Right now, immediately upon the election of the new president a year ago, November, the media jumped on everyone who had been talking about resistance, myself included, because immediately half the nation feared an authoritarian regime was going to take power. I feared that we had elected an authoritarian strongman who would build up a new Western Defense Command, as I say, Department of Homeland Security, build up ICE, and of course that has happened. But my fears have eased over the last 12 months in this regard. That although our president has authoritarian tendencies, he proved not to be smart enough to carry them out. Right? I mean, simply, I'll put it out there. I mean, he just can't. He's not competent enough or thoughtful enough to sustain a course of action. He has those tendencies, which I feared, but hasn't happened. But as we all read now, our democratic institutions are being damaged and torn down. The media is under attack. The free press is under attack. And these are conditions that occurred in 1930s Germany, where you start to soften or tear down or weaken the fabric of our institutions, and that's a precursor to a police state, if you will. So we're still at a very dangerous point, and again, there's not a sustained effort to do that, but another attack. We're going to be right back there, and we have to resist.
You want to? I can use this one. All right. Now, I live down in the city of Dayton. Yes, a certain administration is not intelligent enough to do certain things, but society has. And one of the things is that I'm working with some of the teachers and some of the other people, because even though we have this large number of enrollment in regards to Hispanic and Latino communities, the students are not coming to school. Why are they not coming to school? Out of fear. And that in itself is an incarceration, is an imprisonment. Because when we begin to confine ourselves away from mainstream, then yes, what are we doing? We are imprisoning ourselves, we're enslaving ourselves. And so getting those communities and getting those families and getting people to let go of those fears. But when we begin to look at America itself, America's based on what? Fear. And that is one of the things and that's our greatest enemy, is fear. It's not white people, it's fear. I mean, when we begin to look at all the dynamics, then, so we are, in fact, enslaving and imprisoning ourselves. And you can see that. And, here's a teacher, she said, Guy, I have 42 students. And I said, okay. She said, they're gone. I said, what do you mean they're gone? She said, they don't come to school. She said, they're not coming to school. And she said, and every time we have an incident, on the 27th of November, there's a lady that's going to be deported in the community of Inglewood, which is just north of Dayton. And once again, immigration. And these deportations are happening almost daily. And we have to wake up, people. And we have to begin to speak out for each other, all of us. These are good people.
Yeah, I think what's so scary about the question that you're raising for us is sort of what I mentioned, which is that capitalist tendency to privatize, commodify everything. Everything. The air, the water, blood, our organs, everything has to be commodified. And at the extent where you're privatizing these prisons, that's a post sort of 60s, 70s into the 80s development that I find to be particularly terrifying, in the sense that you're creating a machine there where people are profiting off of the process of incarceration, whereby incarcerating somebody is no longer really costing the state money, and it's often even, there's evidence that it may even be costing the state more. But it's sold as though it's not costing the state money, but it's in fact reaping super profits for the investors who own these for-profit prisons. And that's just a terrifying thing that I see. And we have experts actually in the room who write about this. And that development, to me, the idea that you're taking a person and through incarceration are profiting off of their incarceration. I mean, what a horrible society, we've created, and, this needs to go.
Thank you. Next question.
So I have a couple questions, if you'll humor me. First, I have a two-part question for you, Ms. Foreman. You mentioned that in 2012, and I was kind of horrified to hear that the remediation program for housing remediation in Cleveland was cut. So I kind of wanted to ask, what was initially included in that remediation program? And then based on that, I have a follow-up question, if you wouldn't mind.
So we were actually, the Environmental Health Watch started off as like a training center to train reentry folks on how to abate lead hazards. So we've been a recipient of those dollars since 1990. And so what happened is basically for the first time, our city did not receive that money. So there was a dependency, I feel, on that. And at this point, I feel that those dollars only deal with 200 homes. I said we had 94,000 rental properties. We have more than that, So we have city monies and county monies. So the dependency on those HUD dollars are not going to be the remedy for our situation. But based on that, the risk, the house can be fixed. It's capped at about $8,000 for the city and $10,000 for the county. And at this point, we do have those dollars back, but the children with lead poison are prioritized. So it's almost as if, when I'm hearing this, I do inspections for the county department, community development as a contractor, but I'm finding out that those folks are being prioritized. So therefore, it's not really a prevention program because you might not even get addressed. So we have to look at other ways and systematic ways of looking at our housing stock and move away from the dependency. And then we calculated that if we enforce the rental registry, the city would earn $2.3 million. So that increased income could then lend itself to helping families deal with some of the housing issues. We have conversations around pay for success models. I talked to George Rodriguez, who's the editor of Plain Dealer, and we had some conversations. So there are people in the community trying to figure things out, the public-private partnership and what we need to do to bring resources to address. I'm not interested in discussing full abatement because I think that's not practical, right? It's not practical. So we talk about ways we can keep our families safe in a way that people can actually do some real remediation to manage, because most of our housing stock is built before 1978. So we're not going to be able to fully abate all the homes because we're just not getting those type of resources.
Yeah, and so then to follow up on that, I think something that especially is on a lot of people's minds within the University Circle area is how programs like this that are moving to remediate homes and move people into safer environments also complements combating gentrification, particularly in this area, this region of Cleveland. So I'm just curious as to how that has taken a part of the conversations that you've been having.
So I'm in conversation with neighborhood housing services, and they're looking at land trust and talking through that, because what we don't want to do is have safer housing stock and then affordability is an issue, or people being displaced because now people feel like they could capitalize on a healthier home or whatever. So I think that we need to be clear and intentional about having a conversation about gentrification, about affordability and things like that. With the HUD dollars, there is a sign-off that the landlord, if there is a landlord situation, they won't raise the rent. Okay. I mean, so I think that when we talk about holistic approaches, we can't leave that out of the conversation.
Awesome, thank you so much. And then I have one more question for Professor Flores. So you talked a little bit about the boom of the private prison industry, especially in the 90s, moving into the 2000s. But I was wondering if you could speak to the genesis of that, like where that comes from. You were hinting at it a little bit as far as the capitalization and commercialization of imprisoned peoples, but where does that kind of idea come from, and the notion of being able to capitalize on, imprisoned peoples?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I know my colleague and dear friend Tim Black here could speak to the way that's happening to most U.S. citizens. I'll address right now how that begins to happen to, let's say, immigrants. So 1983 is the year that the INS contracts out with what's called the the Corrections Corporations of America, which now is known as CoreCivic. It's the first time a for-profit prison company receives this sort of contract with the INS. And the INS sells this by saying, we, the state, the federal government, then won't bear those costs. But what these four prison companies then do is charge the states for holding on to detainees. And so today they charge anywhere between $80 to $130 to detain an immigrant for a day, and they charge between $150 to $350 to detain an entire family for a day. And that's tax money that they're receiving for detaining people. And as you can see, they can make more profit then by providing the least amount of food, the least amount of medical care, and basically providing the barest of necessities. So the ACLU has documented time and again that these for-profit detention centers basically push at all of these boundaries in order to maximize their profits. As I mentioned earlier, and as you saw on one of those slides, they create these units, these isolation units that are designed that they themselves state are for corrective purposes, for punishment, and yet it's just common practice for them to take all their overflow people and put them in it, because ultimately, as private corporations, they aren't regulated the way the Bureau of Prisons sort of regulates public prisons. And so what you have here is a relationship between the investors who are lobbying to continue to criminalize immigrants. You have investors who are profiting directly off of this process, and they're profiting in many ways at the expense of all of us who are paying taxes, because there's very little evidence that they're actually in any way cheaper, because ultimately they're seeking to make the most profit that they can off of this process. But I see that that begins early in '83, and then it just accelerates in '88 and into the '90s with Clinton's legislation, which I mentioned. It just sort of just starts to explode, and the numbers are just like incredible. And the stories that you hear about just how brutal it is in some of these detention centers. I mean, the things that the ACLU documents are really, they're really, really inhumane. It's really, really disgusting.
Thank you.
Just as a caveat, they're pimps, and they're pimping the American public, and it's a shame. In terms of solutions, other solutions over the next 4 years as we move to deconstruct state, local, and federal violence, and even the violence incurred as a result of white male-dominated supremacist systems and all the transmutations and transformative vestiges inherent in that. What other ways can indigenous people and individuals in the community engage to change the policy narrative regarding U.S. supremacy and imperialism? And you might speak to, if you get a chance, prisons, poverty, which you've already spoken on that eloquently. Lead in the water, that was very eloquent. And healthcare, police brutality, and gentrification. Thank you.
Can't answer that. So I think when we are trying to pull together leadership, and I've actually worked on pushing and building capacity of leaders and resident leaders. So the question about having an open mind, sitting at the table with these folks who actually impact health, who make decisions about health and policies. I mean, we are really being intentional about calling out systemic racism as a core and a root, instead of allowing, people to still go down this programmatic lane. So I think that we do have teams of folks working on eliminating structural racism, and those things are happening. It is a process. It's not going to happen overnight. But in some other areas around the sustainability work, we're looking at having folks define and create their own systems and operating outside of the system, that they run in their own, and they have ownership over their gifts, their skills, their talents that no one can take away from them. We don't have to ask for permission. It's how do you intentionally create a space for people to own and run their own life and create income for themselves and things like that. Not to say that there won't be barriers along the way, but we're really trying to infuse that idea and that mentality with the people who are mostly impacted. So we try to work on that as well, even with some of the housing work is talking about power and allowing folks to have more access and more power, in their hands in relation to their situations.
All right. If the last question is short, then we can take one more.
Well, sure. I mean, I guess I was hoping Dr. Flores would speak to that question because it's sort of what you ended your talk with, which was where do we go from here with regard to the state violence being perpetrated against migrants here?
Thanks, Andrew, for your question. Yeah, where do we go from here? I mean, I think we're in a really bad place, and there's an incredible amount of oppression and pain. People are bleeding, and I think we need to start acting, and we need to come together to act, and I think we really need to start reconsidering our for-profit economy. A for-profit economy that puts profits not only over people, animals, everything. It just places profit over everything. We really need to consider whether food should be a commodity. Should water be a commodity? Should healthcare be a commodity? And I think we need to move to decommodify every single thing that we can within this economy. That's what I think that we need to do. And I had a slide up there, and I'm glad you pointed out that I wanted to end with, which was in the 1910s, the Mexican people all rose up in rebellion and started the Mexican Revolution. And one of the revolutionaries was named Ricardo Flores Magón. And one of the things he argued, and he tried to express to the Mexican people, was that there's a real fear of the unknown, but there's a real sense of what we have before us that needs to go. So we might all fear what we may create, but if we look around us, the oppression is so great, we need to take steps to move to that unknown. Because ultimately, he believed, as I do, that working class people, we can produce the goods and provide the services that we all need. We can do that. Working class people can do that. And I think we need to start having conversations about expropriating property. We need to start having conversations about factories that are idle, about how do we have millions of people in the United States that are homeless with millions of boarded up homes. There should be no homeless people in the United States. It shouldn't exist. And so I think we need to start having those conversations, and we need to start taking action.
Thank you.
I think on that amazing note, we will have to end plenary session 1. So to ensure everyone has a small break, we're going to go ahead and end it. But we do encourage you to continue this discussion with your peers and our panelists as we begin to organize for our breakout sessions. So please refer to the information in the back of the room on the back door on the topics of all the breakout sessions as well as the locations. And thank you again, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your think tank.